Photography 1, Lecture 5, Black and White. This image by Ansel Adams was made in 1941. It's called Moonrise Hernandez, and for obvious reasons, it depicts the moon coming up over a small town in New Mexico called Hernandez. This was made very quickly. It was not a destination that Adams expected to be making any pictures in, but when he came upon this scene while he was driving back to where he was staying for the night, he was so struck by the scene that he pulled over in his van, mounted his camera on the roof of the van, and took this one image. It's for me, a remarkable coming together of events. You have the moonrise, you have these spectacular clouds in the background that look like they're from another planet, and then you have this very kind of sweet town down in the foreground in the desert. And it took an extraordinary artist to see this as, for the potential image that it is. This is an image that's very different, made in the city, in this case New Orleans. This is by Robert Frank, and it's from the series that would become a book, The Americans. It was made in 1955. And as I say, it's a very different image from the one that Adams made, yet the same care was taken in making the image as the Adams image. This is made with a 35 millimeter camera, but instead of it being more about the natural world, it is very much of the urban world. It also has a social theme, and the concerns are very different, except that both of these are great black and white photographs. The first images, of course, were black and white. As I talked about a couple of weeks ago, Niels voor Niepce invented photography in 1826. But he did not release his invention to the public. He left it to two other inventors to do this, and they released their inventions pretty much simultaneously. The processes were different. This is an image by William Henry Fox Talbot, a British photographer, who came up with a process that allowed him to make negatives, and from the negatives he could make as many prints as he chose. We'll see in a minute how that differed from the Daguerre type. Fox Talbot was also quite a good photographer. For the most part, he used his own estate as subject matter. And this is from The Pencil of Nature, which is actually a portfolio that UCLA has a copy of. There were not a lot of them made at the time. Unfortunately, because of the nature of the paper and early processing, the images are fading to the point of almost non-existence. I was fortunate to see them about 40 years ago, and they were already very pale then. I have no idea what kind of condition they're in now. But at the same time, Louis Daguerre in France, this is 1839, came out with his invention. This is a photograph that he had made a couple of years before he had released his invention. But it shows the view out of his studio window. And this image has a very particular distinction. It's in fact the first image of human beings that was ever made. This was actually a very busy street in Paris. And if you look in the lower left-hand corner, there is a gentleman getting his shoes shined. And because he was in that fixed spot, he and the person shining his shoes, they stayed in that one spot long enough that they were recorded. There was other traffic. There were horse and buggies and various other vehicles and lots of people, but because they were all moving, they did not record in the final image. The daguerreotype is different, as they say, from Fox Talbot's invention in that every one of them is completely unique. There is only one of this image. There only was ever one of them. They're very delicate, they're beautiful, but because they couldn't be reproduced, Daguerre's process did not, although it initially was extremely popular, it didn't last the way that Fox Talbot's did. This is an image by Francis Frith, who was also a British photographer, and he decided to become one of the first travel photographers. He and his countrymen had been hearing about exotic places, but had never seen anything other than drawings or paintings or heard descriptions of structures like the pyramids. But in order to convey what the scale of these structures was, he knew that it was important to include people. So you can see that just in front of the Sphinx, there are 3 people sitting in the sand. And if you look in the distance and to the left, you'll see it appears to be a horse led by another man. And there is still quite a distance before you get to the Great Pyramid at Giza. It doesn't, perhaps do it amply, but it was an attempt to show that these were incredibly large structures. Around the same time, a little bit later, after the Civil War, photographers like Timothy OSullivan, American photographer, who had been employed during the Civil War documenting that, was hired by the government to go on surveys that were expeditions that were going into the West, in the Western United States, with the intention of documenting the various places that they were going to, and in order to come back with evidence of how spectacular these places were. This particular image is of Canyon de Chelly in New Mexico, and it shows what appear to be really tiny buildings built into the cave in this rock. Those structures, however, are 2 and 3 stories tall. This is potentially very deceiving, but in fact, we're looking at a very large rock face. Somewhat later, this is Gertrude Casebeer, who was for all intents and purposes, a society photographer that would seem to do her disservice because she was actually quite a fine photographer. But she had access to people with means, and the subjects of a lot of her photographs are the wealthy. In this case, I think it's a very sweet portrait of a young girl and her mother in what appears to be quite an opulent environment. The quality of light is very soft, and this is a hallmark of her work. She's usually referred to as a pictorialist for that reason. Her images have a very kind of impressionistic feel to them. A photographer who was very important to the pictorialists and, in fact, to photography in the United States was Alfred Stieglitz. And he was a great champion of photography. He was a photographer himself. He also, though, had a gallery in New York and showed photography regularly there, as well as having brought in fine art from Europe. He was the first to show Pablo Picasso and other artists, Rodin and others. And but he also was a publisher and came out with a book, a magazine, a periodical that showed nothing but photography, or at least primarily photography. This image is very typical of Stieglitz's work. It's a very pared down, simple composition, but very powerful. Again, the tones are very muted, which is part of what categorizes him as a pictorialist. But at the same time, it's a very bold composition with the tree in the foreground, trees in the middle ground, and in the background, kind of hovering over everything, is the Flatiron Building in New York. One of Stieglitz's proteges was Paul Strand, and this is arguably Strand's best known image. It's of Wall Street, and he plays with scale, I think, rather effectively here. There's no way to really tell what the size of these windows is, and it looks like these people are really, really tiny. But in fact, the windows are a couple of stories tall. They actually, within them, have a number of windows. So each one of those is at least 20, 25 feet tall. What makes this, I think, an extraordinary image along with that is the way the light is coming in from the side and the fantastic shadows that are cast by them. Eugene Ah Cheh was working around the same time as Stieglitz and Strand, but in Paris, chose the city as his subject, starting in the early 1890s and until he died in 1927. And his mission, he'd been a number of things, and once he decided he was going to be a photographer, his mission was to document Paris as completely as he possibly could for as long as he could. He saw that the city was changing rapidly, and he wanted to create documents that described what the city was like at the time that he was living in it. Ah Cheh has had a huge influence on many photographers ever since, largely because he is so direct, and at the same time understands composition and but allows the subjects to present themselves honestly. There's no artifice with Ah Cheh. What you see is what was actually there. This is an image made in one of the parks in Paris, and it gives you a sense of first of all, the otherworldliness of it, but also the great depth of space that we see here. We see the topiary trees in the foreground, and then larger, more natural-looking trees in the background, separated primarily because of the tonality. The atmosphere between the trees in the foreground and the background really mutes the tones of the trees in the background. Alexander Rodchenko was a Russian photographer who was very interested in experimentation, largely with angles, points of view that are unexpected and unusual. In this particular case, he's photographing down with the intention of revealing the shadows from people walking by. The shadows become much more evident than the people themselves. But Rodchenko's work, this is a hallmark of his work, often looking down, also looking up, finding angles that were unusual, not expected. Man Ray, who, when he was in Paris, which he was for most of his career, befriended Eugene Ah Cheh and was a fan of Ah Cheh's work. But Man Ray's work was very different. Most of the photography that he did was manipulative in one way or another. In this case, he had decided to place the F-holes that one would normally find on a violin or a cello and place them on this woman's back. Always tongue-in-cheek, always good sense of humor. And as playful as this is, it's also a very valuable image. His prints go for a lot of money these days. They're highly coveted. Each one, some of them, there is only one print. Others, they're a very small series, and as a result, the quality, but also the quantity, dictates a very high price. This is by This is by Edward Weston, who's an American photographer, and this pepper is actually Weston placed this pepper in a large oil drum, and because he liked the light within the drum, and he set it on his porch and set up his camera. And this exposure apparently took several hours to make because it was very dark, and he was using an extremely small aperture in order to have as great depth of focus as possible. Apparently he had to make a number of exposures for each of the images that he envisioned, because every time a truck would drive by, the vibrations of the truck would cause a blur in the negative, and he'd have to do it all over again. This is, to me, an extraordinary image, very sensual, it's beautifully modeled. It has a very three-dimensional feel to it. The lighting is just spectacular. This is by Walker Evans. Evans was the best known of the photographers who were hired by the WPA, that's the Works Project Administration, during the Great Depression. It was a make-work project in which the photographers who were hired were, they had one objective, and that was to document the United States during the Depression. It was to keep them employed, but also to show what conditions were like during the Depression. This image is so far and above that simple directive that this is one of the most important images to me by anybody. Evans' strategy is incredibly complex. It seems simple and direct, but a great deal of thought went into how this was framed. First, you have this crazy barbershop with the stripes on it that look like they were done by somebody on LSD. But surrounding it, you have this strategy that's very much of Evans' own device. You'll notice that while you see the barbershop in its entirety, around it, all of the objects are cut off. In other words, you have a balcony overhead. We only see part of it. It goes out of the frame. On the right, we see a portion of a door. In front of that, we see just the front fender, the front bumper and fender of a car. And on the left, we see part of a drugstore window with a portrait in it. And above that is yet another balcony. The idea here is that through showing bits and pieces of the what surrounds this scene, we have a sense of what the larger scene probably looks like. There's great reference to what is beyond the frame without actually showing it, or just showing portions of it. And then in the middle of it, you've got this wonderful woman standing there. She looks very proud, and she's wearing a blouse with a cobweb motif, and she's got this jaunty hat and a very jaunty expression on her face. So in the middle of it, you've got this sense of humor, but with this incredible attention to detail that Evans put into most of the images that he made. This is by Bernice Abbott. She had been Man Ray's assistant in Paris, and in fact, she had also become friends with Eugene Ah Cheh. And after he died, she was instrumental in rescuing a huge trove of his negatives and prints, something on the order of close to 10,000 negatives that Ah Cheh had made, which he then brought back with her to the States and eventually would leave to the Museum of Modern Art. This image is perhaps her best known. It's made from the Chrysler Building, looking down into the streets of New York. And it's incredibly striking and certainly was very unusual for its time in its stark black and white pattern of light and dark of the scene in New York. This is by a pair of photographers, the Bernd and Hille Becher, who were German and working primarily beginning in the 1950s, made exhaustive series of various kinds of structures, cooling towers, water towers, coal mining equipment, and a whole variety of other things with the intention of showing as many types as they possibly could, which they would then present in grids like this. And the objective in presenting them like this is to show the differences between them. They would also quite exhaustively make these images, very often having to build scaffolding in order to create a point of view that matched what they saw as the best way to see them. The Bechers have become well known because more recently, as well as being fine photographers, because they also were photography instructors in Dusseldorf. And among their students are Andrew Skursky, excuse me, Thomas Struth and Thomas Roof, and a number of other very well-known photographers working today. This is by W. Eugene Smith. Smith was a photojournalist and one of the Life magazine photographers and perhaps the best known of them. Starting in the late 30s and up through the 50s and 60s. This image was actually made in the early 1970s, not long before he died. He became a crusader of social causes, and he went to this town in Japan called Minamata, where, because of the fishing, the instance of mercury poisoning in the population was extremely high. He was intent on documenting this and ended up paying for it pretty much with his life because there were powerful factions who did not like him revealing what was going on. The thing is that this is an image that I think far surpasses his intention. It's a beautiful image. It's also very disturbing. This is a woman bathing her grown daughter who has been horribly affected by mercury poisoning. And I think it's a lasting testament to the power of the camera to persuade people that these kinds of events are going on. In a very different light, this is Jerry Ullsman, who, beginning in the 1950s, began combining images to the point where he would take images specifically because he knew how he could combine them with other images. This is long before Photoshop. He would do all of this in the darkroom, taking elements from one picture and adding them to another, very often whimsically, allegorically, and using various other kind of ideas and techniques to create these very unique images. This is by Cindy Sherman. It's from the Untitled Film Stills series. And this is the work that first drew attention to her, made in the late 1970s, and eventually was shown in New York, where it became a sensation. And you're probably already aware of Sherman's work. She has still consistently only photographed herself seriously. She now works primarily in color, but has gone through a lot of different techniques and using makeup and styling her hair differently but always with the intention of using herself as the subject matter of her pictures. This is by Robert Adams, a photographer who began in Colorado and was very interested in the environment and depicting what he saw as threatened and at the same time being able to see the beauty in the landscape around him. This is a very subtle image, I think quite beautiful and haunting, taken at night obviously, or at least at dusk, and with just the street light illuminating a bush and a car in the foreground, this great sky in the background. This is by Herb Ritz. Ritz was primarily a fashion photographer, celebrity photographer as well, and but with an incredible eye for very graphic black and white imagery. This is an image of Cindy Sherman, who he made many photographs with, and the large black element is actually something like it's fabric, something on the order of a cape, which is being blown by the wind. And Ritz was a master at finding this kind of moment where something came out of nothing in order to make a spectacular image. This is by Hiroshi Sugimoto, a Japanese photographer who has worked in New York for many years. He's a conceptual photographer. His series are usually extremely restricted in how they're made. This is from a series of seascapes in which the horizon is always absolutely in the center of the frame and is always absolutely horizontal. And the only difference from one image to the next is the way the ocean and the sky look. And at the same time, there is a great deal of variety. As you see more and more of these images, you get that they're not all the same by any means. And they're also taken in a wide variety of places around the world. This is by Michael Kenna, a British photographer who's lived and worked in the States for most of his career now, who's works in the square format. He shoots only medium format. He still shoots film, although I understand that he's more recently started photographing digitally as well. And he's primarily interested in finding very graphic possibilities in the world. There's a lot of architecture, but there's also a great deal of nature. And finding an image like this, which has wonderful contrast between the windmills on the ground and this amazing sky above them. You're just constantly looking for moments exactly like this. I mean, having the same power. Again, this requires black and white monocular seeing at its highest level.